Morning, everyone. My name's Susan Elliott. I'm President, CEO of the National Committee on American Foreign Policy, and it's my pleasure to welcome you today to our very important discussion, Forecasting Climate Diplomacy and International Security. Many of you today are new to the National Committee who are participating, so before I get started, I'd just like to thank not only our new participants, but the National Committee's sustaining members, funders, and Board of Trustees. With their support, it gives us the opportunity to create an array of virtual and in-person public programs. So for those of you who are new to us today, we're very pleased that you're here, and we hope that you will continue to partake in our programs. The NCAFP is a nonpartisan, nonprofit policy organization, and it's dedicated to facilitating discussions, not only to these this morning, which are public, but we also work on informal, what are called track 1.5 and 2 diplomatic dialogues. And we host private roundtables and private discussions with thought leaders and experts around the world. And some of the areas we deal with are cross Taiwan Strait, discussions about North Korea. And we also have a long history of discussing issues related to Northern Ireland. But today, I think this marks the beginning of UN General Assembly. We were just talking about, it's a great that this is a virtual program, so we don't have to worry about getting around in New York City today with all the streets and the roads closed. But it's also the beginning of Climate Week in New York, an important summit mobilizing world leaders, experts to advance constructive policy around climate change and climate actions. And I don't need to tell any of you, but this past year's climate events have made startling headlines. Everything from the record temperatures around the globe in July, not just in the US, but around the world, multiple landslides in southern China from unrelenting rain, wildfires in Siberia, Hawaii, Quebec, and most recently, the deadly floods in eastern Libya. Climate change has exacerbated the political impact from such weather events, often affecting the most fragile governments, and creates things like food insecurity, armed conflict, and problems with migration. Furthermore, analysts have directly correlated climate change, as I said, to large mass migration and destabilization of global supply chains and disruption of energy grids. So what we want to look at today is, how should world leaders, here we are in New York City, world leaders are coming together at the UN, and how should world leaders discuss how we're going to mitigate these changes? Is there a clear path between climate risk and climate security? And in a world with increased strategic competition among major powers like the US and China, at what juncture should national and geopolitical security override climate policy or vice versa? So these are a lot of very difficult but important questions that we want to explore today, and to help our leaders to look for ways to come up with solutions or how we're going to deal with the climate crisis in the future. So I'm just going to introduce to you our panel of experts who will be discussing these issues this morning. I'll start out with Dr. Justin Dargin, who's a non-resident scholar in the Middle East, and he works at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. He has extensive experience working on a multitude of issues relating to global and Middle East and North Africa energy sectors, geopolitical affairs, climate change, emergent carbon markets, and regional industrialization. He also is a senior fellow and climate scholar at the University of Oxford, where he pioneered the first policy prescriptions for development of carbon markets in the Middle East. So we're very much looking forward to hearing what he has to say. We also have Ms. Erin Sikorsky, and she's the Director for Climate and Security and the International Military Council on Climate and Security, the IMCCS. She's also an expert in geopolitical risk, strategic forecasting, and national security implications of climate change, particularly in the nexus of geopolitical competition and climate change. And we also have Dr. Carolyn Kissane, and Dr. Kissane serves as Associate Dean and is a clinical professor at the Center for Global Affairs at New York University here in New York. She teaches graduate level courses examining the Central Asia region, transformation in China, the geopolitics of oil, comparative energy politics, resource security, civil society organizations, and women's movements. And Dr. Kissane, that's quite a portfolio. So we're really looking forward to hearing your thoughts and having you moderate today's discussion. But she also is a coordinator of energy and environment concentration at the center, and is a faculty advisor at the Energy Policy International Club. So just before we get started, a few technical points. If you do have a question during today's discussion, look at the bottom of your screen and you can use the Q&A box to put in your question. Dr. Kissane and the NCAFP staff and I will be monitoring the questions, and we hope that we can get to all of them, during the discussion. But I want to thank you all today for joining us, and I really look forward to today's discussion and to having the NCAFP be more involved in this issue in the future. And just a final reminder, this webinar is being recorded, and for those of you who maybe have friends or colleagues who can't participate today, we will put it on the NCAFP's YouTube page shortly after the program. So with that, I'll turn the program over to Dr. Kissane, and I look forward to a great discussion.
Thank you, Susan. Thank you so much for your generous introduction, and a very warm welcome to our audience. Thank you so much for taking the time to join this really critical conversation. I'm really delighted to be in conversation with Erin and Justice. And just at the outset, I also want to extend my thanks to Susan and to the team at the National Committee on American Foreign Policy for organizing this event. And I'm really excited to get questions from our audience. So please do put your questions, share them with us. We'll try to get to as many questions as we possibly can. I can guarantee you a very rich discussion given Justin and Erin's background and their experiences in this space. So Susan kind of set us up. This is the beginning of the UN General Assembly. It's also the beginning of Climate Week. There are just an inordinate number of issues, right, on the table, both from the impact of climate on national security and global security, what we've seen over just the past 6 months in terms of climate change impacts. So we're going to try to, dive into as many of these issues as possible, but we're going to start with something that, Susan asked us and I'm going to ask to the panelists. So what types of conversations should world leaders be discussing this week, given the fact that it's, I'm sitting here in New York, we have, world leaders coming from around the world, civil society organizations that are gathering, and again, not just part of UNGA, but also as part of Climate Week. So not just what should they be discussing, but how should discussions about U.S. national security and climate change intersect? So if you, maybe we can start with you, Erin.
Sure. No, thanks, Carolyn, and thanks, Susan, for being here. I'm looking forward to the conversation. I'll take the second part of your question first, right? How should U.S. national security and climate intersect? And I would argue that there isn't a national security issue that the United States cares about today. There isn't something that's going to be on the table at UNGA this week, right? Whether it's President Biden or Ambassador Linda Thomas Greenfield, that will come up where climate change isn't playing some role in shaping that landscape, right, against which the conversations are happening, whether it is the competition with China, right, which includes access to resources, which includes issues like food security, critical minerals, right, whether it is risks of extremism and terrorism in parts of the world that we care about, whether it's instability in places in sub-Saharan Africa or Central America, right? Climate change is intersecting with all of those things. And to understand and make good decisions, right, about national security, about policies, the U.S. government needs to be able to bring a climate lens, if you will, to the discussion. So we can't just have the climate office and the climate policy over here and the rest of, foreign and security policy over there. And we pursue these two things in parallel, right? They need to talk and intersect, and we need to discuss the trade-offs, the opportunities, because whether it is around, cutting emissions, right, getting to the goals laid out in the Paris Agreement, that obviously has implications for other foreign and security policies, or whether it's things like adaptation, right? As you just laid out and as Susan laid out, we've seen this summer already, climate change is here, right? This isn't some future threat. This is happening today. And so to manage in this world, to manage challenges around migration, I mean, look at what just happened in Libya, right? You need to be able to think about how we adapt and how we fund that adaptation. The last thing I'll say here, because I'm really interested in what Justin has to say, is, every year the Director of National Intelligence goes before Congress and she has to lay out what threats she sees in the coming year, right? And when she did that this year in the US, one of the things she highlighted was the growing gulf between the global north and the global south on issues related to climate finance. Who pays? Who's responsible for funding adaptation, funding countries through their mitigation? And she thought that gulf and that tension there was a rising issue, geopolitical issue that the US would have to deal with. And I think when we look at what's going to be on the table at UNGA this week and what conversations are going to be happening, I am sure that climate finance question is going to come up, and what the United States and other global north countries need to do. And that intersects with geopolitical competition with China, right? Because they want to be the ones that countries are looking to. There are lots of different issues going on there. And so I think it's a really rich area to explore, and you can't separate the climate from the rest of the issues that we care about.
Excellent. Thank you so much. That was fantastic, Erin. So Justin, over to you. So what should world leaders be discussing? And to what Erin, shared with us, thinking about U.S. national security, thinking about the intersection with climate change, would really welcome your thoughts on this.
Oh, sure. Well, thank you very much, Carolyn. And also it's a pleasure to be able to address all of you today. Well, I think one of the major issues that actually has been neglected has been climate adaptation. I mean, so currently climate adaptation is only about 10% right now of climate finance, and it has really taken a back seat. And climate adaptation is, I would say, directly connected with American national security concerns. And we can even look at this internally as well. So for instance, even if we go back historically, during the Dust Bowl exodus in the U.S. until about 1940, about 2.5 million Americans left their homes and they went to other areas in the country. And this caused a fair amount of issues with social cohesion. Now, if we fast forward, of course, to Hurricane Katrina and so on and so forth, at least internally within the U.S., there hasn't been this focus on how we would be able to adapt internally within the U.S. on any type of extreme climatic events. Now, if we look at that from a security prism, there have been very major, let's say, impacts on American military installations domestically. So if you look out west, for instance, there's a threat of droughts and fires and so on and so forth. And if you look out east, for instance, there's the issue of sea level rise, and then also hurricanes and so on and so forth. So the issue is U.S. national security should look at what potentially can happen domestically within the U.S. and then also externally as well. So these two issues also have to be considered whenever we talk about any type of climate change in American security interests. Now, going back towards climate adaptation, most of the issues that we are going to see in terms of American foreign policy deal with first, second, and third order climate change impacts. So if we look at the first order climate change impacts, of course, that deals with direct threats to U.S. military, direct risks, to U.S. military installations. So if we look at how U.S. military installations are going to be impacted by extreme climatic events, then if we look at the second order impacts, and typically this is how we view events that are ongoing in the Middle East. So for instance, if we have food price increases due to temperature rises or droughts or so on and so forth, how does that cause social political unrest within the region? And that's typically what we're concerned about when we consider the impacts of climate change within, let's say, the MENA region. Now, the third order impact of that, and I think that this is something that the US security establishment needs to really remain cognizant of, how our global rivals are going to be able to take advantage of the third order impacts of climate change, which leave openings for, let's say, our global rivals, of course, to get in there, to get into the MENA region and be able to exert influence. And of course, we've seen this happen since the Arab Spring, which of course we can relate back to, let's say, a significant degree to climate change impacts. We see China, Russia, of course, building relationships with Egypt, of course, after the downfall of our long-term ally, Hosni Mubarak, who of course had many issues. He wasn't necessarily such a good person, but still he's an American ally. We see it happening in Saudi Arabia as well. The UAE, where potentially a Chinese military base may be built there. So we need to unpack whenever we consider climate change for American security, national security interests, first order, second order, and third order. We need to create a type of unified policy that takes into account all of these issues.
No easy task. And I think both of you also highlighted this sort of tension between the financing, right? The climate financing, but financing mitigation efforts, but financing adaptation, which is, very much what we're seeing now in terms of, and how do we mobilize finance to address adaptation? I think that's also going to be a really big issue on the table. So Justin, I'm going to pick up on what you said and ask Erin. So in light of all of the, climate security threats as they impact U.S. national security, and as a, vis-a-vis a non-traditional threat, how do we think about cooperation or the opportunity for cooperation with, for example, China? We have the ongoing, war against Ukraine, thinking about both strategic competition, but also the need for cooperation, especially with China, as the U.S. and China being the largest carbon emitters, and connecting that with what Justin said in terms of its ability to have influence and impact across the Middle East and across the continent of Africa. I know this is no small feat to address this question, but I would welcome your thoughts on this.
Sure. I think a couple things I would say on cooperation versus competition and how that plays into the climate question. I think, both the United States and China, and really any country on the global stage, is going to take action to cut emissions and act on climate change because it's in their own national interests. Right? That's the driving force of most countries. And we need to recognize that and understand that. So sometimes I get a little frustrated with the conversations around cooperation between the US and China, because I think it can focus too much on cooperation for cooperation's sake. Like, right, what are we doing this for? And certainly when they're both big emitters, they can send a signal to the rest of the world, right, that this is a priority, that this is something they're doing, and other countries should follow. That's important. I also think there's room for competition, kind of race to the top in terms of investment in clean energy technologies, investment in the energy transition that can benefit mitigating climate change, right? And so we shouldn't be afraid of that, and we shouldn't think that the two things are mutually exclusive, right? That's on the other side. What I sometimes hear is, okay, we can't do anything on climate because we have to compete with China. And if we do something on climate, that takes away from the competition. And I think that's, again, the wrong way to look at it. I think in terms of areas for cooperation, there's been progress between Special Envoy John Kerry and his counterpart on things like methane. I mean, the fact that they keep having conversations is important. I think when it comes to adaptation, it's been really interesting to watch U.S. leaders and adaptation and finance, U.S. leaders travel to China and encourage them to invest more in climate finance. I think that's another place where, maybe there's room for kind of healthy competition with both the U.S. and China upping their game in terms of how much climate finance we're providing to other countries, right? But I also think we have to recognize the limits of that cooperation and recognize that there are other other things we need to look at holistically for moving forward on climate, and that it's not necessarily either or, right? Either we compete with China or we address climate. I was just rereading the new national defense strategy from the United States that came out under President Biden, and the key term in that document is integrated deterrence, right? That we're going to use all arms of the US government to deter our adversaries, and we're going to use our allies and partners to deter our adversaries. And I think climate change plays a big role. Climate policy can play a big role in that, because investments in our allies and partners to manage climate risks, right, to help them adapt, as Justin was talking about, has co-benefits in competing with China. And so I think we need to think more systematically and more holistically about how we approach both the geopolitics question and the climate question, and not see it as black or white, one or the other: cooperation, competition, climate action, or no climate action.
Yeah, no, that's excellent. I think there's also like a really interesting argument that even without cooperation, if both, let's just taking the two cases of the United States and China, if both continue to work on fulfilling their commitments and their pledges that were made in Paris, that will that there will be significant success in that in terms of reducing emissions. So that this idea that we need cooperation in order to see advancement and to see progress, I think is sort of challenged by that idea that if both countries really do sort of stand firm on their commitment and do it, as you point out, for the economic benefits that come back to the country and the national security benefits in hand. Justin, how would you, any additional thoughts that you'd like to add to that question?
Oh, sure. Thank you, Carolyn. Actually, the way that I look at it, I think that competition is inevitable in terms of if we look at the clean energy transition. And one of the reasons I view it as being nearly inevitable is because clean energy investment is now viewed as one of the means to, let's say, rehabilitate much of the American Rust Belt. And even we can see this issue that has come to the fore even in the past few days with the strike, the UAW strike, for instance. So a concern about the switch over to electric vehicles and so on and so forth. And the overall concern about what the clean energy transition means to the American labor force. So given that is a concern, and we can see that China has spent billions and billions of dollars in investment into controlling, I would say, the key arteries of what is necessary to foment and to continue the clean energy transition. If we look at, let's say, solar panels, if we look at even solar panel cells, for instance, I mean, even the nuts and bolts that are required for the clean energy transition, critical minerals, and so on and so forth. So if the U.S. government sees the clean energy transition as a means to for economic self-interest to economically develop, then of course there is going to be economic competition at the very least with China, and that is undeniable.
Thank you, Justin. So I'm going to stick with you because you talked about the clean energy transition, but you also, as a Middle East expert, understanding the large role that fossil fuels play in the Middle East region for the Gulf region, and the fact that the Conference of Parties number 28 will be hosted in the UAE and chaired by Al Jaber. What is your assessment of the Gulf states and economic dependency on oil? And I know that there have been efforts, and we see the results of some of those efforts in terms of how many of those states have looked to diversify their economies. But I'd love to sort of get a sense in terms of how you sort of see this playing out in the region. Will it be a destabilizing force, or is the commitment in place to kind of that coexistence between the continued production of fossil fuels and at the same time, moving forward with the clean energy transition?
Well, that's a very good question. I think we need to go back actually to about the mid-2000s. And of course, during the mid-2000s, even leading up to Copenhagen, many of the oil exporting Middle Eastern countries, in particular the Gulf countries, they were quite resistant, we could say, towards any type of global climate change regime. Now that began to change in about 2007, 2008, when many of the countries began, the energy-rich Gulf countries began to have natural gas allocation shortfalls. So we began to see blackouts that were percolating throughout the region and so on and so forth. And then at about 2011, of course, when you had the Arab Spring, so there dawned upon many of the policymakers the notion that climate change was not necessarily something that would inhibit their economic growth, because beforehand they had thought it was a hoax perpetrated by Western countries in order to forestall their economic development. Instead, they saw that there would be clear economic benefits and opportunities that would be derived from the clean energy transition. And that's when you began to see sustained policies, investment policies that were developed around investment in clean energy. And then you also see that the promulgation of these national strategic plans, national vision statements that were predicated upon pushing the Gulf countries towards becoming, let's say, sustainable global partners and also clean energy development internally. But to get to the end of your question, actually, last part of your question, what the Gulf countries are doing is that, in terms of the self-interest that I indicated earlier, is that they see the development of renewable energy, let's say, deployment within their countries as a means to reduce domestic hydrocarbon demand. Now, that's quite essential to remember. So the thing is, they want to be able to reduce their domestic oil and natural gas demand in order to be able to export more to the global market. And this is something that's known as the green paradox. And the green paradox was a type of theory that was created, or at least explicated by this German economist. Basically, what he stated was that any global climate regime, let's say framework, operates as an announced expropriation. So what does that do? That actually pushes a country to try to produce as much as possible its natural resources, such as oil, being the case in point. So what we're seeing is billion-dollar investments in capacity expansion in their oil sectors, let's say the UAE, Kuwait, and Saudi Arabia, in order to export as much as they can to the international market. And then, of course, that has the unintended consequence of increasing greenhouse gas emissions due to their reaction to global climate change regimes. So that's something to consider as how the Gulf countries want to navigate this clean energy transition. But they do see the writing on the wall, though, and they recognize that within the next few decades, they won't be able to continue to export as much as they can, and that they would have to reduce their reliance on this export sector.
All right. Well, thank you for that. Yeah, there's a lot to follow up with, but we're so many issues to cover. So, Erin, I'm going to move over to you. And this is not a simple question, although none of these questions are simple. None of these issues are easy to address. But, in Susan's opening, she talked about what we're seeing in terms of, climate change being correlated to mass migration, destabilized global supply chains, stressed energy grids, and other disrupted geoeconomic and social models, which also in turn then increase internal and transnational tensions. Sometimes those lead to direct conflict. So in light of all of this and the fact that, we are in the, at the outset of the UNGA and Climate Week, what are, again, maybe one or two of the types of policies and postures that governments and militaries can take to ease the impact of these cascading effects? Again, I mean, this is tough. So if you want to just take part of it, but I'm just from your perspective, when you think about policy priorities,
Right.
how should they address this?
Right. No, it's a good question. And I think, given the scope of things you've laid out, right, the range of ways in which climate touches and creates risks, I think two of the most important things that governments and militaries can do, one is getting better information right? And then building a workforce that is able to take that information and integrate it into their policies. And let me talk about both those a little bit. I mean, information piece, on the one hand, compared to a lot of other foreign and security policy issues, the data we have on climate risks going forward is quite good, right? We're quite confident in some of our models at different levels of carbon emissions, what we might expect. There are challenges in terms of downscaling that information to the level of our local communities and local policymakers that would be useful. There are also challenges related to some of the parts of the world that we care most about in terms of security, but having good data. So parts of sub-Saharan Africa, right, because we haven't been collecting. So there's improvements there we can make in terms of the information. And this is something that I know the UN has been working on. They've got a program, the acronym is CRAFT. I think it's complex risk. Oh, I'm going to forget the A and the F, but it's a big AI, big data program. And they've launched these kind of challenge grants to organizations to better use big data to both build early warning systems for risks and better understand risks. The US government's doing the same. NATO has some accelerators that they're putting into place. So better information, but then also you need to build I think what you can call either a climate strong or climate literate foreign policy workforce and national security workforce. And this goes for the US, but it goes for really everywhere. And this is, again, I mean, I sound like a broken record sometimes, but where this integration needs to take place, right? Where you have the people who are sitting on the regional country desks who know enough about climate change, about where to get good climate information. They have partnerships with climate scientists in the other parts of the federal government, right? So that they can, when they're doing their analysis, when they're doing their policy recommendations, or you're having your country team meetings out at embassies around the world, that the climate piece is part of the conversation and it's well integrated. And so I think there's a lot in terms of not just training, but culture building, right, within the national security and foreign policy establishment, that this is, this isn't extra, this is part of your day to day. And I think doing those two things will then make sure that you're building better policies writ large, right? That when you're at, a development agency, you're better positioning your humanitarian response to be climate sensitive, right? Or if you're at DOD and you're into the combatant commands and the regional combatant commands, you're building your ops plans with an eye toward climate. If you're thinking about supply chains, all of those different things. If you're responsible for migration policy, which I think is really hard, and we could have a whole separate conversation on that about what's actually happening with climate migration and what policies we need. But it's about building that capacity, I think, within the security community to address these issues that will have the most effect.
So a quick follow-up, when Biden came into took over the presidency, one of the things was to make sort of climate change and address it from an all-of-government approach. Mm-hmm. Everything that you just outlined in terms of recommendations and approaches, to what degree do you see that in place within the context of the U.S. government? What more? Clearly, a lot more needs to happen, but I think there's been significant progress from the position of the U.S. government. Where do you see some significant gaps, or an area that has that we could make a quick win in terms of really bringing a stronger climate lens to the.
Yeah, I think certainly progress has been made. We're in a better place than we were 3 years ago, right? I think the challenge with, building workforce and building capacity there is it's not a quick fix. It takes time unless you throw a lot more resources at it. And I think there needs to be more resources. I think there was I see a little bit now in the US with, okay, we did all these reports. We did everything that the executive order said at the beginning of the administration on tackling the climate crisis. We wrote a national intelligence estimate. We wrote a defense climate risk analysis. So there's a lot of acknowledging the problem, but it's the moving to action then, right? That takes more time. I would like to see the State Department's done some really good work where they've created a new cadre of climate foreign service officers, but it's very small, right? I'd like to see that expanded more quickly. I'd like to see a hiring blitz and a prioritization of climate or of scientific literacy amongst those hires. I don't think you need to hire a bunch of climate scientists, but you do need to hire people that have scientific and data literacy, building an outreach program to bring that on. Because I think we don't have time to waste, right? We have to move quickly. And I would like to see at the National Security Council more, often the functional issues are always kind of sidelined compared to the country issues, right? And I'd like to see more integration there. I understand that Ukraine is really important, and obviously we need to focus a lot on that, but we shouldn't let that completely crowd out climate as a priority for foreign policy as well. So we can walk and chew gum at the same time, right? Yeah, so I don't know if that totally answers your question, but I think keeping the foot on the gas, right? We can't let up.
Excellent. No, I love everything that you shared. I think those in the audience who have who might be in a position to influence and impact. I hope you were taking notes when Erin was speaking. So thank you for that. So Justin, I'm going to move to you. I mean, and this, again, going back to Susan's opening, there is a significant disconnect, right, between what we're seeing in more developed economies versus the developing economies. We see it in terms of investment into renewable energy and the energy transition that is actually, unfortunately, growing in the divide is growing. And you have a country like India, right, which is, on the thrust of is showing significant growth. So how should rising and middle income powers balance economic development, increased energy demands, and at the same time be addressing, climate change and also the internal security threats that are connected to climate impacts?
Yeah, well, absolutely. So, I mean, this relates back to, let's say, my earlier statement as to how many of the energy-rich Gulf countries viewed the clean energy transition. I mean, so I believe that first and foremost, this requires a type of revolution, a psychological revolution. I mean, so in the sense that, again, you saw many of the middle powers, or let's say the rising developing countries, they viewed the clean energy transition as being inimical to their economic growth, macroeconomic growth, and so on and so forth. However, if they were to, and I think that this is coming right now, instead of necessarily viewing this as being, let's say, a good global steward of the environment, I think that this change is coming whereby they see that there are many economic benefits are to be derived from the clean energy transition, to the degree that, for instance, if you look at a country, but if you look at, again, to the Gulf region, or if you look at China or what have you, the billions of dollars of investment that you have in renewable energy infrastructure. I mean, so this percolates throughout the value chain. Let's say Saudi Arabia, for instance, is using as a template, doesn't want to just secure investment in renewable energy production or the organs of it. What they want to do is they also want to localize production as well of, let's say, solar panels and also other advanced technology related to renewable energy, and that they feel that this would operate to facilitate and to create backward and forward linkages throughout the national economy. So you would also be able to have, with the incorporation, let's say, of an industrial base related to renewable energy technology production, you would also have a viable finance sector as well, which could be connected with that. You would also have a jobs, employment, and educational and training sector that would have to grow with that as well. So if you have a type of cluster strategic economic planning that's related to let's say, the clean energy transition, then this can be used as a means for many of the middle income countries to be able to benefit quite significantly from this clean energy transition, as opposed to necessarily viewing it as a threat to their economic development. So that's why when I said earlier, this requires a revolution of thinking, a psychological revolution, whereby they can see the benefits that can be derived from that. Although there still are risks, and I don't want to speak over, but the risks, and this relates back to your first question, in that if the countries do not take advantage of the opportunities that are there, particularly the energy-rich countries, outside of the Gulf region. So if we look at Venezuela, if we look at Mexico, if we look at, let's say, Algeria or what have you, then they run the risk of having increased austerity measures, reduced economic growth, and also that can lead to, of course, increased social political instability. And this will require American national security analysis to look at the second order indirect causes of climate change. And I think AI predictive technology, for instance, which analyzes that, will be able to have be of great use. In that. And if I could just say quite briefly, prior to the Arab Spring, if you looked at Google, for instance, Google search terms, you could see a particular amount of angst that was related to many of the governments where the Arab Spring spread through. I mean, so technology has increased since then, AI technology and so on and so forth. So you'd be able to perhaps in the future be able to see where climate change second order impacts would cause socioeconomic instability. And I'm sorry if I ran over, so my apologies.
No, excellent. No, I appreciate it. As I said, I'm going to be sort of calling you both up after this to sort of for expanded follow-up, because it's all so interesting, and again, very much aligns and connects with the work that I do. Erin, I have a question, two questions from the audience. I'm going to start with you. The first one is, there's a question as to, and you outlined earlier in terms of the, what the Biden administration has done, has implemented. There's a question as to, the possibility if in 2024 there is a change at the top, and the possibility of a Trump presidency, or another Republican, for example, who may not put climate change first. How much do you think would change or not change?
Yeah, I mean, it would certainly be a change, because that leadership aspect that a president has to put items on the agenda is really important, right? So I don't want to minimize that. What I will say, though, is I think that, especially when it comes to climate change and national security, we've seen through successive both Republican and Democratic Congresses, Republican and Democratic White Houses, that the National Defense Authorization Bill here in the U.S. has included provisions related to climate security for multiple years. And I also think, frankly, because these hazards are hitting home so much more frequently, right? We started at the Center for Climate and Security a tracker to track military responses to climate hazards globally this summer. And just here in the US alone, the number of National Guard days that are being spent fighting wildfires, right, or responding to flooding. I think it's going to be hard to turn the ship around to not focus on managing that. So I think the issue will still be front and center, but certainly I think the U.S. leadership has the potential to be lost on the international stage, right, which is really problematic, and other things could go backwards. So it would not be ideal, obviously, and there would be serious concerns, but I don't think it would be a full-scale reversal.
Great, very diplomatic response. Thank you for that. So we have another great question from David Lockdeer. And again, this is for both Erin and for Justin. How do we take the general discussions among world leaders regarding mitigation initiatives to concrete issues that are likely to cause international and internal instability? So climate change-driven internal displacement, cross-border migration, water scarcity, and international conflict over water allocation, and of course the declining crop yields related to water scarcity. So I think that kind of like really sort of goes in line with one of the an earlier question in terms of thinking about priorities around what countries could do to mitigate against climate change, but then in terms of the immediacy of climate impacts and how they have to nationally address. Maybe Erin, will start with you and then move to Justin.
Ooh, I was hoping you would start with Justin for this one, because it's a hard one. No, but I mean, I think, it's a question that I think speaks to this, what Justin was talking about the need for a focus on adaptation and resilience, right? Like mitigation is one thing and very important, and we have to do it. But even if we cut all emissions tomorrow, the challenges that are laid out in this question are all here, and we have to figure out ways to manage them. I think on the water piece in particular, I think this is a place where for a long time, there's actually been real opportunity from cross-border transboundary watersheds, right, as a way to build confidence and build collaboration and peace between countries, right? If the academic literature shows that shared water, transboundary water, can often lead to peace, not just conflict. But that's changing as the amount of water in these shared rivers around the world change. And I worry a lot about places like the Mekong. I worry a lot about the shared rivers between Turkey and Iran and Syria and Iraq, right? And you've got Ethiopia and Egypt and Sudan on the Nile, all places where we've seen flashpoints, the shared rivers between China and India and Pakistan. So I'd like to see a real focus, a policy focus on some of those potential hotspots, right, around the world vis-a-vis water security. And I don't know what you do. Do you just set up some task forces? Do you set up some working groups to look at those places as real risk areas of conflict? But I think digging into that and developing strategies ahead of time to manage that before we get to crisis points would pay a lot of benefits. There's a great new satellite that was just launched by the US last December, the SWAT satellite, another acronym I'm not going to remember what it stands for, but it's launched by NASA, run out of JPL in California, and it's measuring all the fresh water around the world at a level of fidelity that we've never seen before. And so it's a great tool that you could use to leverage, right, some real tough conversations between countries and tough water diplomacy, right, to come up with some plans to manage these tough watersheds. I think, creative thinking about policies like that, where you bring scientists together with security and foreign policy folks, new universes of interactions where you break down silos between groups, could be a way to approach some of this that is frankly much separate from the mitigation conversations, but still really important.
Excellent. Thank you. Justin.
Oh, yeah,
anything you'd
sure. Again, I would actually second Erin's statement, is that we really need to segment, or at least unpack mitigation from adaptation. Now, of course, there was the type of concern that if we focus on adaptation, then that would take away from the urgency of mitigation. And I really think that we need to rethink that because climate wars are actually here. I mean, they're here right now, and that's something that we need to understand. It's not in the future; it's now. We can even trace back the 2003 conflict in Darfur in Sudan. I mean, that can be, let's say, if not directly, but substantially attributed to climate change due to the dwindling rainfall that occurred, and also desertification and lack of grazing land, which caused rebellion, and then also government repression and what have you. And then if we look at, again, Syria, again, that was a significant proportion of the drivers that led to the Syrian conflict, of course, can be, let's say, the receipts can be had back to climate change. And then Somalia, even the Lake Chad basin in Africa, Boko Haram. I mean, so climate conflicts are here right now. So that's one thing that we need to consider, and adaptation really needs to take the front stage. Again, only about 10% of climate finance is composed of adaptation. Investment. And it is thought that about $500 billion will be needed per year, let's say by 2050, for developing countries. And it's simply not there yet. So what I would suggest actually is that we simply get the private sector involved. I mean, such as we got the private sector involved with mitigation efforts, renewable energy. I mean, so we can see that the mitigation, let's say investments, private sector has seen that there is a wealth of opportunity that's involved. So initially you had public policy that was the driver. Now we have the private sector, whereby in 2022, last year, renewable energy investment has reached parity with fossil fuel investment. So that's what I think. I think that if we involve the private sector much more, which requires education as well for multinational investment funds, for banks, for institutional investors, and so on, how there can be return on investments in terms of climate adaptation, let's say investments in developing countries and so on and so forth. So this does require education, but I do think that eventually, quite soon, just like mitigation, I think that the private sector would be able to take, let's say, the reins of climate adaptation investment, and this would be able to assist many of the issues that are plaguing developing countries with potential social political unrest related to climate change impacts by helping them address that. So that's actually what I would think is important at the moment.
Excellent, thank you. I know that there's a lot of emphasis on the role of the private sector, what corporations can and need to do, and the UN Global Compact right now, I think, as we probably speak, addressing the role of the corporate sector. I know Denmark today is 30 of its companies are announcing some very bold pledges in terms of what they're going to do. But I think the role of the corporations in the financing of adaptation is an important one. Erin, because when we're thinking about the transition that we're in the midst of, nuclear energy has received kind of a lot more attention in the last couple of years as a zero carbon emitting baseload source of power. But it's also remains very controversial. But we see in places like China, Saudi Arabia, and other countries that they are, really looking at nuclear power as an important part of their systems and as a critical part of reducing emissions. What are some of the maybe one or two sort of security implications of this, or what security threats to be considered?
Sure. I mean, I think, Justin's layout earlier of the first, second, and third order threats kind of applies with the nuclear energy question as well. I mean, climate change actually poses a first order threat to some nuclear facilities, right? As you think about either running out of water, as France has done the past couple of summers and had to shut down production at their nuclear plants for periods of time, or too much water. Obviously, nuclear energy facilities are often built on coasts, right? Because they need a lot of water. But then when you have sea level rise and storm surge, that can affect plants as well. So, and I think I worry about new installations being built places. Are we thinking through correctly the climate trajectories? So there's that direct risk, but then there's the indirect risk, obviously, as well. What I'm worried about is that, China and Russia are the two players on the international stage willing to sell nuclear capacity to other countries, right? And I don't trust their safety and security in terms of proliferation regulations or how they approach it very much. I worry a lot about proliferation risk there. The fact that the United States is out of the game in terms of nuclear energy internationally, I think is probably problematic in that space. Because I do think, you look at any of the trajectories, how we meet the Paris Agreement, how we get to net zero by 2050, right? I think nuclear has to be probably part of the mix, but there are ways to do it safely and securely, and we need to be careful there.
Excellent. And Justin, I know, Saudi Arabia, and of course today we had the announcement from the Biden administration that in Iran, 5 prisoners, U.S. prisoners, have been released. Iran, I don't need to sort of tell you or the audience in terms of the history between the United States and Iran, but what does this, in terms of, and also looking at, countries where you still have significant energy poverty and lack of access to reliable and affordable energy, how do you see the role of nuclear energy?
I think that nuclear energy could play a significant role in the energy transition. But of course, as we all know, that there are significant risks related to that. And using, let's say, Iran and Saudi Arabia as a case in point. So Saudi Arabia, for instance, has 2 bids currently, or excuse me, a bid up currently to build 2 nuclear facilities as part of its eventual fleet of about 16 nuclear reactors. And at the moment, Saudi Arabia is looking or engaging in conversations with China in order to build those facilities. But again, as Erin indicated, their proliferation stances may have a lot to be desired, China and Russia. So the U.S. is a contender, and the Saudi government would prefer to have a U.S. involvement because the U.S. has the gold standard. But due to the rise of, let's say, a multipolar world, at least as regards to the nuclear sector, this leaves other players in place where countries can turn to. It takes a very nuanced stance, because if Iran does reach weaponization capability in terms of its uranium enrichment and so on and so forth, and ballistic weapons capability, then I would say the nuclear genie is out of the bottle, because Saudi Arabia has already indicated that it wants to have full control over its nuclear fuel cycle, and it wants to retain the ability to produce nuclear weapons if Iran does have the ability to produce nuclear weapons in the future. So really, we have to really put the spotlight on what happens in the MENA region. And I think that if Iran does develop nuclear weaponization and then Saudi Arabia would respond in kind, then I think that entire nuclear containment regime that we have had over the past few decades would fall apart. But on the other hand, I do think that this will lead to nuclear energy investment as well across the world. So
the two sides of the coin. So
right.
One last question, it's a question from the audience. I think it's a really important question. And Erin, I'm just going to ask you maybe in like a minute. There's a question about U.S. infrastructure and also sort of dependency on China on critical minerals and on other renewable energy technologies. We're seeing also in Europe around EVs, offshore wind, so many other things where, China has really gained a very significant lead. Is this how, again, in about a minute or less, how should we be thinking about this? And, what are your thoughts?
Sure. I mean, real quickly, I think this is why you saw in the Inflation Reduction Act and the Chips and Science Act on Capitol Hill a real focus on, onshoring these things here at home or friend-shoring them to allies and partners and investing to build up the U.S. capacity to do some of this itself. So I think that's the strategy, but that obviously you can't do that overnight, right? There are a lot of things that we use that we rely on outside of the environmental and climate sphere that come from China as well. And so I think being careful to make sure that we're really thinking about what the real risks are here. And I sometimes think the political conversation goes, frankly, a bit overboard as to how, we can't, on the DoD basis, we can't possibly have Chinese solar panels. Well, we've got chips in our computers that come from, it's a political thing, not a real security risk thing. So we have to be careful.
I agree. Just wanted to say, I concur. Okay, well, thank you so much. I want to extend my sincere gratitude to Justin and Erin. Thank you so much for a really dynamic conversation, touched upon so many great issues. I hope our audience will continue to sort of dive into these issues. Thrilled to hand it over to Susan Elliott, the President Director of the National Committee on American Foreign Policy.
I just want, on behalf of the National Committee and our staff and trustees, to thank all three of you for this really important discussion. I think given the number of questions we had from the audience, we need another hour or so to go over it. So I hope we can have another program again in the future. But thanks to all of you for really, again, an insightful conversation. And we look forward to engaging in this. And I hope that all the participants will continue to be engaged and engage not only in discussion with experts and colleagues, but with your elected officials and people in your government. So thanks again to everybody.
Thank you.